I would like to start, I thought, by reading a little bit from the book. It's true, the book is informed by a deep sense and understanding and love for music of a particular kind, the pibroch, which as many of you will know is the classical form of Highland bagpipe music. Bagpipes still a rather misunderstood instrument, and even as we were coming in, we were very much hoping to have some music play of a pibroch that was the lament for himself from the book. And considering the kinds of bagpipe music we normally hear, which is the kids busking down on Princes Street and whatever. But no, it's a very different kind of musical form, and it's a music that informed me from my very earliest childhood. In fact, when I was born, there's a family story that has my mother saying to my father, you know, now we have a new baby, maybe you should stop playing the pipes for a while. Nonsense, my father said, it will help her sleep. Well, in fact, it does help me sleep. And I think because of this, I think because of the intervals and the music of pibroch being part of my earliest memories, it's been playing around with my imagination for a long time. And for a long time, I knew that I wanted to write a book. And yes, let's do talk about this word novel, because I'm uncomfortable about that kind of term for the kinds of fiction I'm interested in. But I knew I wanted to write a work of fiction that used pibroch as its kind of structure and sound. And like all my work, I begin with a very clear sense of a landscape and an opening line. And the line that came to me for this book, the hills only come back the same, I don't mind. The minute I had that line, I had the sound that I wanted for the book. And once I had the sound, I knew I could then go ahead with the structure of it, which, again, according to pibroch, is very clearly structured. And we have the urla, which is the ground, in which all of your kind of musical ideas, your themes are laid down. And we have the tuala, which is a development of that, but also a leaping away from it, what I think of as a kind of leaping into vacancy, a kind of a risk is taken. With a shift of theme and so on. And then we have the crunla, the crown, in which the piper will show off all kinds of their embellishments and additions made to the music, and the piper will demonstrate these, but demonstrate them even more fully in the crunla mach, which I think of as a kind of reflexive movement, wherein the composer and the piper is kind of exposing the workings of the tune. And my father indeed has confirmed that is a good way of describing the amach movement, which is quite an abstract thing to get across. So I had that idea very much to be the shape of the book. And I also knew that the book began with an old man on the hills up in Sutherland carrying a newborn baby in his arms. Now, the relation of this baby to the old man, I had no idea. What was he doing up on the hills? No idea whatsoever. It took me 7 years to write the book and discover how I could make these connections. And I'm pleased to say that after 7 years, I did find out the answer to all of the questions. And the music bound the whole together. So the section I'd just like to read by way of kicking off our conversation is from the Tuala section. And we have Callum. We have our old man on the hill is John Sutherland, who's dying, and in these last days of his life, he's bedridden, but composing a pibroch that will describe his own life. And he's, at some point in these last few weeks, managed to escape the house, and he's up on the hills with this child. But since that event, he's been brought back and is now sort of permanently in bed with care. And his son, who lives in London, has been called home to say goodbye to him. And the father and son are estranged. They've not been speaking, and they've not seen each other for a very long time. And John Sutherland is a formidable man and a difficult man. And Callum, his son, is anxious about his returning. So he's dithered. You know, he left very early in the morning. And the closer he gets to the house, the more nervous he gets, and he prevaricates, he stops off, he gets a newspaper, he stops off at a pub and has a drink. Finally, the light is darkening, and we're approaching the grey house. And he comes round the final corner, and there it is, lights on in the side lodge, but the house itself, its peaked gables in the darkness, just a silhouette against the last of the colour when he turns off the car's lights of the sky. The end of the road. A good name for a house, Callum thinks, a good name. The end of the road, a good name for a place that has nothing more ahead of it, and now that he's here in the growing dark, no sense of anything behind him either. Better than the grey house, the end of the road, and better in English too than the Gaelic that makes it sound less lonely than it is. Just say end of the road instead, when the track he's been driving on has disappeared into shadows, and all around him is the sense of building night, the hulk of the hills, the sweep of distance contained within the quantities of the night time. The grey house, the end of the road, all right. Margaret's at the door in the time it's taken to turn up into the driveway. We thought it would be today you'd come, she says to him as he approaches. Nothing about her changed as far as Callum can see, though it's been a good 10 years. Your mother said when we spoke to her, Margaret, he says. Hello, Callum. How are you? There she is, still the same stature, the same calm. He takes her hand, gives her the customary kiss upon the cheeks, and the dogs in the kennels up behind the generator have started barking. It's the strange car, their sense of an arrival, that set them off. You'll see a difference in him, Margaret says straight away. We've had the doctor in, but she pauses. The dog's barking increases. They're wanting to find out who it is, who's there. I know I don't see it in the same way, she's saying, when he's here all the time as he has been these last few years, but even so, just today after yesterday, I've noticed him quickly going down, going right down. We've all noticed it. Quiet, she calls to the dogs then, as though she's only just become aware of them. For their barking sounds desperate. Quiet, with Callum standing there, the strange car. It's as though the dogs can sense him and know that it's him, that it's Callum, even though they're not his dogs and the kennels are turned the other way from the house where he's standing. Still, the sound of their barking makes it seem as though they all this minute want out, to fling themselves out of their enclosures and rush out to meet him, whirl all about him, barking to greet him. Hello, it's me, you're home. Margaret is still talking. You'll notice, she's saying, that in his mind, he's wandering now, imagining, seeing things. The doctor says it's to be expected. They've started walking towards the house, and the sound of barking is even more frantic. It's me, it's me. Callum feels as though he can barely hear Margaret's voice over it. There's the sound, too, of some of the larger dogs thrashing themselves up against the wire meshing of their pens. He can hear that, too, through their barking and Margaret's voice. It's me, let me out and come and say hello, as though it's his return they've been waiting for all this time, that it's Callum they've been waiting for all this time they've been waiting. He's not the same as he was, Margaret is saying. And yesterday, where did you find him? He starts to say. But Margaret's pulling him inside against the cold and this noise, the sound of the animals at their enclosure. It's me, please, it's... Then she closes the door behind him. He had not gone for a walk, you see, she says then. And suddenly it's very quiet. He was far away, Callum, high up in the hills. She waits a couple of seconds. For the best part of the morning, she says. He must have taken himself off at dawn, Ian thinks it must have been, for he had gone a fair distance before he got to him. And the weather had turned, you can feel it now, winter's on its way. And worse, for he had with him. She goes before him, opening the kitchen door that leads from her little hallway. Well, she says, you'll find out soon enough, I suppose. Helen, she holds open the door for him and looks at him. What? We couldn't tell your mother that part, though. She'd worry. And Helen, what about Helen? But by now they're inside the kitchen, and it's bright and strange all at once to be inside and in the warm. Callum feels faint suddenly with it, the lights on everywhere, and hearing Helen's name. What about Helen? What was it that Margaret just said about Helen? Here we are, Margaret is saying to him, and he realises to Ian, where Ian's sitting at the table with the guns and a bottle of whiskey and a tumbler set before him. He looks up at Callum, nods. Callum? Ian? And there's a pause then, like there's always a pause, as though the time between when he last saw Ian was nothing, as though the drive up here was no distance at all, as though it makes no difference at all, actually, whether Callum was here or not, as though nothing makes any difference. Yet, Helen, there was her name. What about Helen? Twice, Margaret saying her name, and nearly saying something, but not saying it. Helen, Helen. Like Callum would say her name 100 times over and still be wanting to say it. Helen, 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 Helen. But instead he says, "How are you, Ian?"
Thank you. That's taken from the Tuala, which is the laying of the ground of the Pibroch. Is that correct?
That's the next movement, which is when we have this departure. The laying of the ground is when we lay out
the
all of the story, the Urla, which is the story of John Sutherland, and starting to understand. Are we doing something wrong? Is it something to do with that? That's okay. I'm a real shouter. I could do this without the microphone.
Same here.
I'm always saying that at Dundee. Can't I just shout?
But in terms of how you've applied this structure of the traditional Pibroch, you're laying the ground in the Urla, and this is the ground. So what kind of groundwork did you do for the novel, or the big music, I think it's safer to call it, then is it national ground? Is it international ground? Is it local? Is it parochial? You may hear that I'm kind of channeling a bit of Tom Leonard, who said in a collection that you also contributed to on the prospect of independence, that the local is international, the national is parochial. And you too contributed to that controversial collection. And I wondered how you saw your book a year on with the independence vote looming, and there's a certain ground it's entered as well as a ground that has been in the making for some time, and how the two meet.
I think Tom Leonard and I were the only people to take that view in that particular anthology too. And I was also very taken by something that Denise Mina talked about at the International Writers' Conference a year ago. She said we must be very careful that when we're talking about regional particularities and richnesses, we're not talking about nationality. I thought that was a very interesting distinction as well. This book is very much a reality that exists between the covers. The pages between the covers of this book are the world of the book. And as an artist, my first priority was to create something that would be absolutely real. Don't move my arms, I just remembered that. To create something that would be absolutely real for the reader, a place where the reader could enter and walk around in and be contained by. I also, as I said in my introduction, wanted to make it my Highland novel. It was not only my, what?
Well, it's just the idea of it, how you think of it as being beyond being Scottish, perhaps. But nevertheless, you've chosen the Pibroch as your kind of formation, so clearly it is Scottish in some sense.
Of course, of course.
So there's a kind of paradox there about how one views the culture one's contributing to in kind of an international global
I think the minute that you make something, you're making it your own, and you're making it in your own way. And I'm very taken with something we've talked about before, this idea that the artist has no passport. The commitment, I love that. I love what James Kelman said when he won the Booker Prize too. Not that he takes the same view as I do about the referendum and the future of Scotland, but he said the artist's responsibility is towards the blank page in front of him. And I thought of the idea of the landscape in my book is absolutely a Scotland that exists and that is real, but it's also an imaginative space. And I'm very sorry to say that the hills in my book at the moment are being colonised by the interests of chiefly the Scottish National Party that are now generating wind farm after wind farm after wind farm for the private gain of a very few, and certainly is not going to make any difference to any of our electricity bills. So yes, I must always return to the idea of my book being ultimately a created thing and an imagined thing. And to the same extent, Jane, I wanted to make that very clear in the sense that the book is full of real hills and real places, villages and roads that we can travel up to and crisscross the terrain, but it's also full of imagined places and imagined roads.
But also perhaps a kind of personal ground too. Again, it's a very personal book in a way, because your father is a famous, renowned pibroch player and composer. And as you said charmingly when we began, you were born listening to this music. You heard it in your mother's womb. So there's a kind of ground behind that is highly personal. So there's an idea of a national stage or an international stage on which your novel might be positioned. But then there's also this very personal, familial one. And your sister too is a painter and has contributed to the projects beyond the words on the page. The big music cannot be contained as a novel, much as I love to think that it's sentences on a page and it's a material object, a kind of literary object. It's also already encouraging and participating in other works of art by other people, some of whom happen to be your family. So I wondered how you felt about becoming suddenly so personal and familial, even though you're taking in a kind of modernist way a kind of experiment in another art form in order to make writing, which could be seen as so abstract and self-reflexive.
Yeah, I mean, it's something I'm always talking to my students about. You know, the great John Gardner, who was a mentor for Raymond Carver and has written wonderfully on the novel and fiction, you know, would always say to young writers, start with what you know, that famous injunction. And certainly it's something I'm always saying to my students. And I think when I look across the landscape of all of my work, there's something embedded within each piece of fiction that is very known to me. But you're quite right, this book, more than any of those others, makes that very clear, because the fact is that pibroch is a very esoteric, some would say difficult form, and as you also said, very personal to me. You know, I had many, many conversations with my father and with his friends about bagpipe music, about pibroch, and it's very, very difficult to get to the bottom of it. Even after 7 years, you know, I still feel in many ways as confused as when I started out. I remember telling a friend about this, and they said, yes, it's a bit like reading Finnegan. It sounds like, from how you're describing it, it's a bit like reading Finnegan's Wake. And that is how I would feel. You know, I'd have these long conversations and do a huge amount of reading and, you know, think I was getting to the bottom of it. And then my father would say something else, or I'd uncover another fact, and I just thought, actually, I know nothing about this whatsoever. But yes, you're right. I mean, that kind of personal thing, the intervals of the music and so on, all of these things very known to me.
So it's interesting that, you know, it's a family novel in that sense, but also that you're born into a family and you participate in a family that are making other forms of art. So your sister is a painter, and she has made environments to respond to this work.
Yes, right now at Dundee, in fact, if I could tell everybody, if you'd all like to come out to Dundee on the 12th of December, we are having a fabulous evening. I mean, I can't even imagine yet what it's going to be like, because it's like nothing else, I think. And it's called the Lament Room, and it's going to be housed in a little local theatre in Dundee. And it's basically going to be, my sister who's an artist, as Jane just said, has created an installation, which is the bedroom from the Grey House, where John Sutherland is lying in the last few moments of his life. And the pibroch will be playing, that is the pibroch that my father composed, based on the fragment of pibroch that John Sutherland leaves us in the book. This will be playing, and there will be actors in place showing us the characters of Margaret, the housekeeper, and Helen, her daughter, and Ian, who looks after the land. And these people will be there and welcoming visitors into the world of the big music. And my sister's created an exhibition to run alongside that, as she created a separate exhibition a year ago. And I think it's going to be quite an extraordinary night, actually. But yes, I love your idea of something, the containment of art and the extent to which it can be contained. And can we talk about that? You know, I'm very, let's go on to this thing of the novel, you know. I think what I'm very, very again, this idea of the novel, because it is such a bourgeois kind of contained thing. You know, it's a bought thing, and there's a sense of it being an owned thing, and then somehow a finite thing, that it comes to us through often the portals of the entertainment industry, you know, described as a jolly good read, or as good as television, or good enough that it can be turned into a film. These kinds of things. It's valued in absolutely monetary terms. You know, I think that there's a great interest at the moment in big novels. You know, you're getting your money's worth, and you're paying over your 20 quid, but at least you get something that's this big. But at all times, we're describing a kind of product that is somehow consumed and understood and then set aside. Whereas I think the work of fiction is a powerful artistic work that can transform us and can take us without the confines of the experience of the story itself to other places of imagination, and yes, in the case of this, to make other things.
Well, I like the way in the passage you just read that there's a sense that everybody is speaking and making, and that although there's a kind of, I'm not so sure the hierarchy persists, the idea of the kind of patriarchy of actual pipers and music makers, the way you make the landscape and the household and the very dogs speak, as James Joyce says, everything speaks, the door creaks, everything speaks, suggests that kind of democracy of making, which can't be contained either by just one person. And some of the best aspects of novel writing and its best features are not that it's commodified, but that the novel is this big, loose and baggy form that's transformative and contains many voices. And you know, it's reductive to think of the novel as something to be invoked in bad faith. However, you're in keeping with Virginia Woolf in this, who, while she was writing To the Lighthouse, said in her diary, I'm not sure what I'm writing could be called a novel. Another What by Virginia Woolf, elegy. And she began to understand that what she was writing, and she actually says, in Anticipating the Waves, can prose chant elegy? Can prose be made to perform like lyric poetry? And for those reasons, and people always consider her work to be highly poetic, but at the same time, there's a social, satiric, kind of everyday work that she talks about that is prose, that does the work of explaining the politics, of entering history, because narrative brings with it story and history, whereas the lyric and music can be understood as vertical rather than horizontal, and not taking us out into the community, not taking us into other people's lives. So I wondered, do you think, we'll leave aside the category novel, what is it that you think, is it prose even that you're writing?
Well, I love your very description then, because what we're imagining is a kind of a crisscross then of the horizontal and the vertical, because of course as a writer of a long piece of fiction, I have a job to do, which is also to tell a story. And there's that notion of there are certain things one has to do. I remember talking to a poet once who said, I'm a poet because I can't be bothered with getting people in and out of rooms.
There's a lovely Tom Leonard poem about just that.
Is
yes,
there?
Yeah.
Oh, I'd love to see that. Yes. Yeah. Well, also, with the vertical, as you described it, which is this lyric job of having us come to understanding, coming to meaning, entering into the work through another, in another way, which is to do with the sound and rhythm and a sense of, you know, understanding a kind of music and the way that we understand and respond to other forms of art, music and painting and so on. It's more abstract and less prosaic. So yeah, I think that the job has a warp and a weft to it, if you like, as a kind of cloth. But certainly my own interests are in, you know, this idea of metaphor and lyrical sound and a kind of synesthesia that you describe, where you're hearing, you know, the sentences sound like they must have a particular meaning rather than describing that meaning.
But that's just to take the kind of surface lyric element of your novel, because they're a huge, I mean, show them how big this novel is.
So I've got all my marks in it, actually.
There's also a huge amount of the language of information here. There are footnotes, there are appendices, is there an index? I can't remember. There's an index. Just like Virginia Woolf's Orlando has an index, and it doesn't have photographs, so.
It has a couple of photographs, actually, and it also has transcripts of radio interviews, and it has maps.
Sorry, I forgot the photographs. I see it as words.
I had a very interesting...
It has maps.
Yeah, it
Show
has
them
maps.
the maps.
Well, it's very difficult on this issue, actually, because I've got so many bits and pieces, because this is my precious reading copy, but I can maybe show up a few. There's an example of a photograph there. That's when the Grey House was run for a while as a local school. Up on the top of the house there was a space that was big enough to put some desks, and the local children were educated there. And we've got here ground maps of the house, which grew up over time because the Sutherland family began with a little tiny croft way up in the hills. But right back then, you know, back in the 18th century, it was no more than a little longhouse. It was a great place for music, and there are early fragments that survive of early compositions. And it was the beginning of the phrase, the winter classes, because the students, those who loved the pipes, would come across the hills, and of course, because the weather was so poor, they would end up staying, sometimes for most of the winter. And as the years went on, the house was added to and became, you know, a bigger, more formal structure, and these winter classes were formalised into a kind of proper Highland piping school. I've got fragments here of bits of pibroch from John Sutherland's compositions. I've got the fragment of the pibroch that's in the book, Lament for Himself. I'm just trying to find you some maps, Jane, but there are loads of maps.
Your reader can travel through the book in non-linear ways, then. That it isn't a book, like some people read James Joyce's Ulysses or Waltz to the Lighthouse, that you plunge in, and it's fragmentary in a way, isn't it? That although you've got this structure, it must be like if you come into the room while the radio is playing and a symphony is already on, or the pibroch is underway, and you know which part of the pibroch, which stanza, if you like, in a poem that you've entered. Does it matter that you read the novel in order?
That's beautifully put. I think, you know, this is what I'm always encouraging in the reading of it. And my sister, you mentioned, the artist, has only just come to the story part of it, I'm putting that in inverted commas, quite recently. The thing she fell upon from the beginning was all the notes and the
language of information.
Yeah, exactly.
But she's busy fabricating, making these new realities. It reminds me of the questions that sometimes my students ask me about To the Lighthouse, which Willie Maley recently put on the list of 100 greatest Scottish books, because not many people realise, even when they're reading it, that it's set in Scotland. So people remember that Virginia Woolf grew up and went on holiday in Cornwall, and so they know that she visited Godrevy Lighthouse. So they think, great, well, if we go and visit Godrevy Lighthouse, that's authentically the lighthouse that is in Virginia Woolf's novel of that name. And then when I started doing research and suggesting that, well, we should take seriously the fact that she has set it on a Scottish island, Skye, even though she never went there, you know, there are Scottish references and allusions and settings that we need to pay attention to. So then people started emailing me and asking, well, which Scottish lighthouse is it? Which lighthouse is it? And there you are, merrily inviting people up to Dundee, not Caithness. I mean, you know, where is there any clear boundary then between the language of verifiable facts about that we can ascertain you do have a father who's a pibroch player, and he has composed music, and there is a place in Caithness that corresponds more or less to this.
Sutherland. But yes, I think, Jane, these are really good questions to explore, because it kind of opens up, doesn't it, into this thing of what counts and what is real. And again, that's quite a kind of political issue in itself. This hunger and desire we have for verification. You know, at the end of the day, what are those students wanting from you when they want to know where that real lighthouse is? And what will it really gain them? What we're surely more interested in is the imaginative reality of that lighthouse in that book, and what that means and what our reading is all about. And I've been very interested by, I remember years ago actually at a party, you know, for the book festival, a reviewer came up and she said, you know, I like your work, but you make me really cross the way you never give place names to anything. And we then went on to have a discussion about why that should make her cross and why it should count. And it was all to do with it goes back to this idea of wanting to kind of control and own and close down imaginative enterprise. Whereas in fact, imaginative enterprise can take us to so many places. And I just love that word that Ed Morgan used about enrichment. You know, the idea that every experience can enrich your experience. I mean, every literary experience can enrich your experience and change the way you might live your life. How much more interesting are these concepts than the idea of what's real and what's not? I say to a lot of people, you know, the War and Peace is as real to me as anything that's happened in my own life.
Well, it's true that we went to war on fiction because of a fiction, so we have to be very careful about the power of fiction. Perhaps before we open